Asia's top security summit has begun in Singapore, but all eyes are on the US and China as tensions rise over the future of Taiwan. So, how is their relationship affecting stability in the region and the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. Defence chiefs from around Asia-Pacific are in Singapore to discuss security challenges facing the region. The three-day summit, known as the Shangri-La Dialogue, attracts high-level ministers, military heads and security analysts. The focus will be on foreign policy, with sensitive diplomatic talks taking place behind closed doors. But relations are already frosty between the world's two superpowers, China and the US. Beijing has warned Washington against interfering in its affairs after their defence ministers met to discuss Taiwan. But while that relationship sees no sign of thawing, others are trying to find common ground. So which alliances might be strengthened and could new ones be established? And how is all of this affecting the balance of power around the globe? We'll be talking to our guests in a minute. But first, Imogen Kimber begins our coverage.
Perhaps one of the most important meetings at the Asia Defence Summit in Singapore is one that is happening on the sidelines. This is the first face-to-face discussion between Chinese Defence Minister Admiral Dong Jun and his American counterpart Lloyd Austin since 2022. And it comes as already high tensions in the South China Sea are escalating. That's been triggered by the election of Lai Ching-te as president in Taiwan, a self-ruled island territory that China regards as its own and to be retaken by force if necessary.
During the meeting, Minister Dong Jun expressed China's firm position on the Taiwan question. Recently, the US government expressed congratulations on his inauguration and sent a delegation to the inauguration ceremony. Regarding this, Minister Dong Jun said the Taiwan question is purely an internal affair of China, and external forces have no right to interfere in this.
China says any declaration of independence by Taiwan would be a declaration of war. That's seen as a response to its newly inaugurated president's previous comments on autonomy. China has recently carried out more military exercises near Taiwan, part of an overall increase in military activity, including around the coast of the Philippines, something Manila has described as worrisome. The US condemns these military moves, but is carrying out joint exercises with the Philippines and continues to provide military support to Taiwan and a strip of allied countries along the coast of China in the Asia-Pacific. China says it's US military activity that is further stoking regional tensions. Australia, Britain, Malaysia, New Zealand and Singapore, the so-called five-power defence arrangements, also say they'll be stepping up military exercises in Asia.
There is a broadening of the exercises that we are doing. In the conventional space, though, we are increasing the assets that we are bringing to bear in exercises. At Bersama Lima later this year, for the first time, Australia will be contributing F-35 Joint Strike Fighters.
Added to that, Beijing has also recently hosted Arab leaders as their relations with the United States become increasingly strained over Israel's war on Gaza. And the Biden administration's decision to allow US weapons to be used by Ukraine inside Russia further ratchets up hostilities with Moscow that China sees as a good neighbour, with both countries enjoying what they call a no-limits relationship. Some analysts say tensions are now so high that open communication and maintaining trade are the most that can be hoped for between the world's two biggest superpowers. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. In Beijing, Andy Mok is a senior research fellow at the think tank Centre for China and Globalization. Samir Puri is a visiting lecturer in war studies at King's College in London and author of the soon-to-be-published book, Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing. He joins us from London. And from Maryland in the United States, David Arosh is a professor at the Near East South Asia Centre for Security Studies. Gentlemen, Good to have you with us. So much to get through. Andy Mok, can I begin with you? Because, there are claims over the South China Sea, Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, and North Korea. The list goes on in this very short programme. So can we just start with the South China Sea? Claims by China over the years for large parts of it. China's investment in its navy, according to official figures, sees around 1.4 trillion allocated between 2024 and 2028. China is putting its money where its mouth is, or certainly in this case, where its claim is.
Absolutely. Well, I think if we look at the problems facing the world today, whether that's in Ukraine, whether that's the tragedy in Gaza that some call a genocide, and the rising tensions in the South China Sea, that none of these conflicts that have broken out would be possible without the involvement and the explicit support of the United States. And I think this is the fear in the South China Sea, that will the Philippines be the Pacific equivalent of the Ukraine, where the U.S. wants to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian? Is it attempting to fight China down to the last Filipino? And I think China has been resolute and clear in saying that it believes in the concept of indivisible security, where every state has the right to security, but not at the expense of other states. And all countries in the region need to have their interests and concerns taken into account. And I think this is the real danger that we run here, that the U.S. may instigate another open conflict in this part of the world.
Yeah, and I know David DeRoche was smiling. I'll come to you in a moment, David. I'm sure you've got something to say about that. But let me go to Samir Puri in London. I mean, Samir, I, like yourself, have attended the Shangri-La dialogue. I've reported on it. I've commented on it in the past when I've attended the situation. Is the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore that real chance for the thinkers, the movers, the shakers, certainly in the military sphere, to, you might say, sort themselves out, have a really defined and very clear chat about what the agenda is and what the red lines are?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I was part of the Shangri-La Dialogue organising team based in Singapore for 3 years. I'm not part of it at the moment, but from my perspective, the Shangri-La Dialogue is an extremely useful opportunity for the US and the Chinese defence ministers, respectively, to be in the same room at the same time. And whether they decide to meet and talk one-on-one is really down to them. But they don't tend to end up in the same room at the same time very often. So it really has a lot of utility there. Having said all of that, last year, Li Shangfu, the then Chinese defense minister, refused to meet Lloyd Austin. This year, his successor, Dong, has agreed to meet Lloyd Austin. So there is a bit more optimism that alongside the separate resumption of US-China military dialogue around restarting their military-to-military hotline to diffuse any potential tensions that might arise around the Philippines, around Taiwan, through military maneuvers specifically. I think there's a little bit more optimism than there was 12 months ago. And that, I think, Sohail, is really what the Shangri-La dialogue allows. Is it gives you an annual stock take as to where the quality of these relationships are. And of course, it allows the defence ministers and their staff who are attending to meet their contemporaries from other countries, whether allies or rivals. And I think it's always good to put rivals in the same room.
Indeed. I mean, Andy, I think nodding in agreement with you there. David, can we come to you in Washington, D.C.? Good to have you with us. Obviously, a chance to reset the button. And I think that Samir touched on the fact that the Americans and the Chinese haven't spoken. And that's primarily because Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan and the Chinese didn't like it 3 years ago. So they really haven't sat in a room together until today. And they've had a very frank conversation by all accounts. But yet, they're going to be talking also about their relationships with Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea and Japan. I mean, they're all forging, should I say, closer ties with the US. We're seeing more military operations and manoeuvres between those countries. And Beijing does think this is regional interference from Washington, D.C. How do you counter that conversation? I'd love to be a fly in the room right now in Singapore listening to that.
Yeah. Well, first off, let me address some of the ahistorical examples. We started off jumping off the top rope into the ring. Look, 30 years ago, the United States had its second largest naval base in the Philippines. That went away. We had our largest Air Force base, Clark Field, in the Philippines. That went away. Our presence in the China Sea in Asia is a fraction of what it was 30 years ago. In 2014, we withdrew all our armored vehicles from Europe. And what we saw almost immediately was the invasion of Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. So contrary to what Andy has said, with a little intervention of Gaza for emotional appeal, the case is not that the United States is wrapping up confrontation, but rather that it tends to withdraw and tries to manage things on a commercial basis. What we're seeing, though, is not the United States driving this, but rather the sovereign nations of Asia, and you listed them all off, who wish to remain sovereign and are seeing a resurgent China which wishes to establish a sphere of influence in which it is basically de facto imperial hegemony. What these sovereign states, Vietnam, Philippines, have seen is Chinese an annexation of their sovereign territory in the South China Sea, and their attempts to visit their sovereign terrain met with force. The United States is the country that they look to try to address this impending Chinese hegemony. But the problem is the United States really doesn't have the military capability that it had 20, 30 years ago, because we ushered China into an era of commercial prosperity, and we hoped that with that would come political reform. Now we're facing a reset, but we are not building up the way the Chinese are. So basically what you have is a democracy which had a very large footprint, now has a smaller footprint and has uneasy allies, facing a country that seems to be determined to establish military hegemony over what it regards as its sphere of influence.
Okay. Let me bring Andy Mok then in here, because David, let me bring Andy Mok, because he's also, I think, politely smiling and nodding, and I know that he wants to come in on that. So Andy, I'm sure you've got something to say here to David.
Sure. Well, David, I think certainly is stating one point of view, and I think his version of history or reality certainly reflects the Washington consensus. But certainly there is a grain of truth in what he's saying, in that certainly the U.S. military has gotten smaller. There have been some withdrawals, not entirely of its own choice, I may add. But I have to point out here that calling China's actions in the South China Sea military hegemony, I think, is quite a distortion and a misstatement. The fact of the matter is there are many contested areas in that part of the world, not just between China and the Philippines, but many other countries as well. And China's official position, which it has reiterated many, many times, is that these issues should be settled through discussion, respect for mutual sovereignty, without the interference of outside parties. And I agree that this is a big question. I know the U.S. does see itself as a Pacific power with interest in that part of the world. But I think other countries, including the Philippines, have had a very troubled, even painful history with the United States, and there's tremendous ambivalence. And we see that changing with the presidential administrations as well. We only have to go back to President Duterte's administration to see what the official Filipino position was with the United States. And it's not unexpected that when different leaders are in power, there are different stances. But I think it would be naive to say that the U.S. is not exerting some powerful influence, maybe even arm twisting behind the scenes here.
Okay, let's bring in Samir Puri in London again. I mean, it touches really on the next area, which is the Philippines itself as a nation. And I think that Andy actually touched on really what my question was, is that, the Philippines' political and foreign policy flip-flops depending on what president is actually sitting in Manila. We had Duterte, who was a little bit more vocal perhaps and a bit more warmer towards Beijing. Now we've got Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos as he's known, who's a little bit more, you might say, friendly towards the US. It's a problem for the Philippines, stuck where they are geographically, isn't it?
Yes, and I think the fact that Marcos Jr. is delivering the keynotes at this summit in Singapore is sort of an inadvertent reward for tacking a little bit closer to the Americans, in contrast to Duterte, as you say. But I think with the Philippines, there's a few different angles to why they are geographically in such an awkward position. There's a Sierra Madre rusting shipwreck, which they're sort of resupplying. That's in the news quite often. Their boats are sort of harassed with water cannons and things like this. But also, in the event of any escalation of hostilities in Taiwan, the Luzon Strait is really the most proximate launch pad from which to deliver not only military assistance, but also humanitarian assistance if it came to that. And if you are thinking very practically about what deterrence around Taiwan actually entails, you have to factor the Philippines in. Just one last quick comment, Sohail. I think I sort of feel as if I'm playing mediator between a couple of the other guests here.
That's the way we like it.
And I think, having spent the 3-4 years in Singapore, the world really is changing very, very rapidly. And I think this sort of either or US or China, it's not really the frame that countries like the Philippines are thinking in. They are thinking about a much more free-flowing world in which the non-Western world, and Philippines being a key country in that, in Southeast Asia, have a lot more options to maneuver. But they are still, in general, in Southeast Asia, opting for China for their principal economic partnerships and to the US for security partnerships. That pattern is a fairly common one across the region.
Indeed. Let's move on now to another non-related but related subject. And China's defense chief told the US that they are not providing weapons to either side in the Ukraine conflict. China holds, and I quote, an impartial position. And I quote again, we have honoured our commitment not to provide weapons on either side of the conflict in accordance with laws and regulations. We've implemented strict controls on exports of military items. This is another bone of contention, certainly with Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Beijing. So I wonder, Andy Mok, let's just come in here about the US being very sceptical of China's role in supporting Russia. How much of a difficult position is it for Beijing at the moment to shake the hand of Moscow and yet say, I want to be a partner in peace across Asia Pacific at the Shangri-La dialogue?
Well, I don't think it's awkward at all. And I know this is how it's often framed in Western narratives. But in my view, China has demonstrated that it is neutral, it is pragmatic, and it is non-ideological. And because of that, it is able to act as a bridge between Russia and its antagonists in the West, not just the United States, but of course, some countries in Europe are very worried about what could happen in Ukraine and what that might imply for their security concerns. Okay. So I think that China plays a unique role as an honest broker here, and certainly has done so in other parts of the world. Iran, Saudi Arabia is another recent example. So I don't see it at all that it's in an awkward position, but in fact, it holds some, I think, quite powerful cards that it can use to promote a more peaceful, stable, and prosperous world, whatever region of the world we're talking about, be that Europe, be that the Middle East, be that the South Pacific.
OK, well, let me flip that then to Samir Puri, because if we look at China's influence in the region and we look at Myanmar, it has had historically been supporting the military junta there for quite some time. And now we're seeing a resurgence of independent armed groups all fighting that military junta, and it's now impacting on China's soil in the north. They're not happy about it, so it's actually coming back to bite them.
Yeah, I would strongly contest the portrayal of China as an honest broker. It perceives its national interests like any state, but I'd certainly agree with the fact it's got much more resource and authority in the world to pursue those national interests than ever before in several centuries, since the century of humiliation. So just with regards to Myanmar, it's clear that not only China, but also Russia was a big arms provider to the Myanmar junta as well in the past. So on a number of issues around the world, Myanmar and Ukraine, China and Russia find themselves somewhat on the same side of the divides that exist. With regards to Myanmar, I mean, that's the coup that happened in February 2021 that brought the military to power. I mean, Myanmar is a conflict-racked state, has many overlapping separate areas of conflict, ethno-nationalist groups, has the coup, has those resistance groups pushing back against the military. And it's a very, very tricky situation for the Chinese. But I think the Chinese have played quite a pragmatic role in trying to manage their commercial interests, their border security, And they're playing that role with the Myanmar junta. They're playing a sort of a parallel role with the Taliban in Afghanistan. But overall, I think there isn't that judgment of regimes for not being democracies post-coup. I think the Chinese will look, if they can do business, if they can secure their interests, and they'll be very happy to proceed. I don't think China is perceived as an honest broker. I think what China will be perceived as is if there's any uptake in diplomacy years down the line, that China can be a guarantor for Russia, just as the US and the EU and the UK could be a guarantor for Ukraine. And all peace processes need each antagonist to have a guarantor, a friendly channel, someone who will maintain economic relations.
Okay.
So China is more on that side of it in the Ukraine conflict equation, I think, as an honest broker for everybody.
David, can I just get a brief response to you on that before I get to my North Korea question?
Well, the main issue, China is in a difficult position with Russia and Ukraine because, as Andy noted, there's a lot of European concern about this, and I would argue that the Europeans are actually driving the train here, not the United States. We're interested, but this is a vital matter. We haven't seen evidence of direct provision of military, things like shells and missiles, but the concern is over dual-use technology, most notably machine tools used in Russian weapon factories, vehicles and communications that are used on the battlefield. And I think the concern for China, which is a great country because of its commercial trade, is that the Europeans are at the point of saying, look, this commercial trade is threatening our security, and so we may have to reevaluate our commercial relations with China. That's a problem for China, particularly as the economy is slowing down as the real estate bubble bursts. Yeah. So this is one of those rare issues that is only marginally American Chinese.
Yeah, well, and of course, one that will be discussed. Let's talk about North Korea now and move the conversation along. It constantly surprises the international community that it's one missile or rocket launch after another. And no one really seems to have a handle on who North Korea is talking to or who North Korea wants to talk to or listen to. David, just very quickly, I mean, how do you handle North Korea diplomatically? And certainly that must be a conversation they're having in Singapore.
Yeah, good question. So the first thing is, look, the North Korean Kim Jong-un regime, which is a dynastic, repressive regime that is hard for rational people to comprehend. It only is able to exist because of Chinese support. Now, I understand that, they have interest in not having a completely failed state on their border, but, do your own research. Everything you see is crazy. That being said, we have tried to talk with the Chinese. Donald Trump tried a little bit too hard. With the North Koreans, tried too hard. I think China can play a useful role there just because they're the only people the North Koreans want to talk to. But the reason why they do that is because they're the vital enabler of the regime. Okay. And this is going to be an irritant as long as you got crazy going on in North Korea.
Samir, can I bring you in? Is this a conversation that would be had behind closed doors in Singapore, where the Americans would voice their concerns to the Chinese over North Korea?
Do you know, of all the countries that would voice concerns over North Korea, it's probably Japan, first and foremost. Just remember the trajectories, and then, of course, the South Koreans, clearly. But I think there is a wider regional picture with regards to East Asia and North Korea that I think would definitely feature in any dialogue on security in the region. And that is simply this. North Korea remains unpredictable, idiosyncratic, as David was saying, but it's also in line with Russia and in line with China. And the possibility that sort of that eastern seaboard of the Pacific and the seas around Japan become an area in which North Korean, Russian and Chinese militaries jointly drill together is a very probable medium-term future. That's very, very concerning. So I think maintaining strategic stability on the Korean Peninsula, that's been a reality in East Asia for decades upon decades, longer than all of us have been alive. And it shows absolutely no signs of waning as an acute problem, despite the fact Philippines and Taiwan and other issues suddenly rise up on the agenda and capture our attentions. But North Korea is the perennial issue and a continual concern.
Yeah, I know you're all in agreement here. I've still got another two big important subjects I want to talk about, and we really can't have this dialogue and this conversation between us without mentioning the Asian elephant in the room, and that is Gaza and the recent membership of Palestine as voted in by the UN General Assembly. Nations that once might have sided with the US, like Singapore, like Australia, who were at the Shangri-La dialogue, voted to allow Palestine to become a member as such in the UN General Assembly. This will irk the United States, I'm sure, because they like to be able to talk to their allies in the Asia-Pacific region very clearly. Andy Mok, what sort of conversations do you think Blinken or even the Defence Secretary will have? I mean, Lloyd Austin, I'm sure, will be talking at length about this behind closed doors.
Sure. Well, I'd like to briefly go back to the North Korea question.
Very briefly, Andy. We're running out of time.
Okay. I see this as a blind spot that the U.S. has describing the DPRK as crazy. I think they're extremely rational and have played their cards very well. And I think this is also related to the Gaza conflict as well, that the U.S. is, in a sense, losing control of the narrative here, that the propaganda, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes, when you look at the tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian women and children that have been murdered, that this really has created, I think, a major turning point in some Western countries, and there's no turning back. And I think the U.S. is on its back foot. It's going to be in a very awkward position here, whether these are Department of Defense officials, State Department, even heads of state like President Biden are increasingly in an difficult position.
David DeRoche, I mean, in terms of comments, we have this whole reevaluation of the American administration. It's all been thrown up in the air in the last 24 hours by the conviction of former President Trump, who's now still running for the presidency. In terms of Asia-Pacific countries, how are they going to formulate, you might say, their foreign policy when they really don't know what's going to happen in the United States in November? I mean, this really is sort of the cat among the pigeons, isn't it?
Well, I suppose it leads to some uncertainty. But if you actually look at the policies, what's remarkable to me is in foreign policy, the amount of continuity between Trump and Biden. And in many ways, Biden is more Trump-like than Trump. So, when Biden was out of government, he decried the Trump tariffs on Chinese goods. But then he just, a few months ago imposed similar tariffs, citing exactly the same logic as Trump. Similarly, Trump, wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, was talked out of it by his security advisors who said what's going to happen is pretty much what we saw happen. Biden steamrolled them and did it. So I think, the personalities are interesting, and certainly, the personality of Donald Trump, I mean, my God, there's no shortage of caricature there. But when you look at the policy, there's actually a lot more continuity than people expect. And I think that the issues of the Asia-Pacific, where we have nervous allies who perceive a threat, that's pretty much a bilateral concern.
Okay,
a bipartisan, rather.
Indeed. There, sadly, we will have to leave it. We wanted to hit all the bases. I think we have certainly given food for thought to our viewers across the world in terms of the Shangri-La dialogue. I'm sure they'll be logging in to find out what is being said there. To all of our guests, Andy Mok, Samir Puri and David DeRoche, thank you so much for joining me here on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail, Rahman and the whole Inside Story team, thanks very much. The news follows us. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.